Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for standing by and welcome to today's webinar, The Organization of a World-Class Sporting Event. This is Cristina Palés from the Johan Cruyff Institute, your host for today's session. Just a few items before we get started. If any attendee has any technical or IT issues with today's webinar, please do the Q&A panel and I will be happy to assist you. We encourage you to submit written questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. After typing your questions in the space at the bottom, hit the send button and please be sure to direct your questions to all panelists in the drop-down menu. Your questions will be addressed, time permitting, toward the end of the session. Your presenter for today is Gemma Rodés. Gemma, now you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Cristina, and welcome to all those attending this webinar today. It's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Deepak Trivedi, a strategic management consultant with many years of experience in organizing sporting events, as well as professional speaker, educator, trainer, and advisor. Deepak has worked with and alongside some of the most influential people in the world of business, professional sport, and hospitality. He has worked as a consultant, for example, with the NBA, the International Tennis Hall of Fame, and the London and Rio Olympic Games, and will also be part of Tokyo 2020. We have 1 hour ahead to talk with him about the organization of a world-class sporting event. Good afternoon, Deepak. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Wherever you want, we are ready for your presentation.
About the US Open as a case study with regards to how the considerations that we need to take into account when organizing world-class sporting events. And we're going to try and cover an overview of many of the important aspects that we need to look at when we're organizing these kinds of events. So let's talk to you about the US Open. You may not know this, but the US Open is actually the highest attended annual sporting event in the world. And that doesn't happen by accident. In fact, the US Open has been able to boast that record of being the highest annual sporting event for a number of years now. The USTA, which is the governing body for tennis in the US, and it stands for the United States Tennis Association. The USTA owns and runs and manages the US Open. And it's very important because the US Open is a chance for American tennis to be showcased during the US Open. One of the important things that I want you to understand is the following point. The US Open is a 2-week event. But 80% of the revenues that are made during the US Open go towards funding the tennis programs all across the United States for the next calendar year. So there's a lot of pressure to make the US Open an amazing event because of the fact that 80% of the revenues, are used for the running of the tennis programs, both at recreational level and at professional level throughout the US. So that's something to have into consideration. One of the things that we have to consider when we're organizing and running the US Open is the type of marketing campaign that we would like to produce. What we need to do is we need to consider the whole aspect of how important the entertainment element is when we're organizing the US Open every year. And as a short answer, sport is part of the entertainment industry. There is an increase in the concert-style ceremonies that global sporting events like the Olympic Games, for example, have. Media coverage is increasing. The drama of competition and the motivation of sports fans is increasing, and all of those things need to be taken into consideration when we're organizing these events. So one of the things I want to look at and I want to talk to you about is why is the US Open unique? Why is it different? Now, every sport has its major events, and in tennis, the major events are called the Grand Slam. In France, where the French Open takes place, it's all about branding. So the sophistication of the French brands, Chanel, Lacoste, even Perrier. And so the branding and the romance of Paris kind of comes to the forefront of when marketing that event. Then you have Wimbledon in June and July, and Wimbledon is all about history. It's all about tradition. It's the only tournament where the players are required to wear white. It takes place on this bright, pristine grass court. Very few logos and sponsorships in and around the main stadium itself, because Wimbledon want to maintain the image, the pristine grass court image and the tradition and the history. And the US Open is very different. The US Open is about how loud it gets. It's about the concert style atmosphere. The tennis stadium is the largest tennis stadium in the world. And they have 2 sessions a day, the day session and the night session. And the night session could go on until the early hours of the morning. So the US Open is unique because it takes on New York's personality. And so one of the things that we are trying to give our international audience is New York's personality. In fact, focuses on New York because actually New York is easier to sell than tennis. So the first few shots we have are the New York skyline, New York by night, and then you tend to have the celebrity endorsement, the tennis players, the fans cheering in the stands. But all of that comes after we've kind of set the scene that this is New York. So just to kind of go back to these things, we're not trying to replicate any of the other slams. What we're trying to do is create a unique atmosphere and a unique culture, a unique sports environment that fans can enjoy at the US Open. So like I said, the Arthur Ashe Tennis Stadium, the largest tennis stadium in the world, 24,000 seats. And as a result, I mean, this has implications when it comes to things like ticketing, for example. So we have, just out of the shot, you can't see it, but we have the upper and lower promenade sections. Then in the shot that you can see, you have the loge box sections, which is the highest point in the photographs. Then beneath the loge box sections, you have the hospitality suites and the hospitality boxes. And then down below, you have courtside seating. And so all of this is really important as well, because different types of seating come with different types of ticketing and different types of packages. We've got to know why somebody would spend $70 and $80 on a ticket versus somebody who would spend $5,000 to $10,000 on a hospitality suite. The communications we have with both types of fans are going to be different, but both types of fans are also going to be important. And whilst we know that this is a 2-week event, you know, there are certain sessions that are going to sell out. So, for example, the Labor Day weekend, which is the middle weekend of the US Open, when people are on holiday because it's a national holiday in the United States, that weekend is going to be a weekend that we sell out. The men's final is also going to be a session that we sell out on. But the earlier sessions in the week, when you have the top players like Serena and Roger Federer and Nadal, who are playing relatively unknown players and should theoretically have easier matches in the opening rounds, those are the sessions that we're not likely to sell out on. So those are the sessions that we have to work with our partners like American Express to try and sell out, and use promotions to try and sell out those particular sessions. So this is really important. And many times, you know, we hear the question, you know, who's more important to us, the person who's spending $80 on their ticket and they're sitting way up in the top of the stadium, or is it the person who's spending $5,000 to $10,000 on a hospitality suite? And the answer to that question is both of those fans are equally important, because both of those seats represent a value. And the session, the tennis sessions, it's not like a retail store where you can go into that store and, you know, if you don't buy a jumper or a shirt that you like, Somebody else might come in later that day or the next day, and they might buy it themselves. Here, it's kind of like an airline. Once an airline has taken off, you can never sell any of those unsold seats again. You can sell seats for tomorrow's flight, but once that airline is in the air, those unsold seats are lost revenue, and it's the same here. Any seats that are unsold once the session is over, that's unsold revenue. We'll never be able to sell the seats again for that same session. We can sell for tomorrow night's session, but not the session that has just finished. So it's very important when we turn around and we look at developing customer experiences and fan engagement, because those are things that increase our attendance levels. So those are some things that we have to be very aware of. It's really important and I know that some of you have asked about this in the questions that I've received, but it's very important to understand that as an outdoor sporting event, and even though we have a roof now, which we've had for the last 2 years, but we are primarily a summer outdoor sporting event. So we're not immune to hurricanes and adverse weather conditions and storms and other things that might happen. And this is where the relationship that we have with our employees, the relationship that we have with facilities teams and maintenance teams really come into play. So for example, years ago, when Hurricane Irene was due to hit New York, there were some issues with regards to the shutdown of the 3 airports in New York, which meant we weren't sure which players were in and which players were not in. But in addition to that, there were other issues, like would the venue be ready for the event? So from recollection, the storm was due to hit New York on the Saturday, and the US Open was due to begin on the Monday. So we had to play the waiting game, and here is where the relationship with the people that set up the venues ready for the event really comes into play, because it takes roughly about 2 weeks to get the venue ready in terms of putting up the stands and putting up food and beverage operations and retail stores and all of that kind of stuff. But here, once everything was put up and ready, we then had to instruct the teams to take everything down, and they had less than 24 hours to take everything down. We then had to assess the damage the next day, which was very minimal, and then we had to tell them that they had now less than 24 hours to put everything back up again. So you can imagine that morale and motivation was pretty low at this point because of the taking everything down and putting everything back up 3 times. What we did know is that if it was Monday morning at 11 o'clock, we knew that there were going to be 40,000 or so people coming through those gates. And if the sun was shining, they would be expecting to watch tennis. They wouldn't care what happened 48 hours ago. All they'd be interested in is that the sun is shining now, we should be ready now. And so this is where the relationship really does come into play, because we have to have the right people in the right roles in order for minimal delays to take place, and in order for us to actually be able to produce this event to a very high class and high level. The other thing that you have to bear in mind also is that the media love negative stories. So we don't want headlines to be, US Open, a disaster before a ball has even been struck. We don't want those kinds of headlines to happen at the beginning of the US Open. So, one of the things that I think is very, very important is making sure that we can minimize risk and minimize disruption. And again, having the right teams and the right people in places enable us to do that. So when it comes to marketing and sponsorship, we have a very different approach to other tournaments. So for example, I gave you the example of Wimbledon. And I said to you that Wimbledon, when you look at the court, even if you're not a tennis fan, even if you don't follow tennis, when you put Wimbledon on the TV, you know that you're watching Wimbledon, because of the strong branding attached to Wimbledon. The bright green grass, for example, the bright green court, very little signage and logos. So you know that you're watching Wimbledon. Now the US Open has a very purposeful marketing and sponsorship strategy. You know, if we look at the demographics of who attends the US Open, it's pretty much an affluent audience. It's about 50% female, 50% male, and obviously in a place like New York, it's something that can offer the sponsors many things of relevance. So let's take, for example, Mercedes-Benz as an example. So with Mercedes-Benz being the vehicle supplier of the US Open, it means more than just simply providing Mercedes with a logo. And so a lot of people, when we think of marketing and sponsorship, we turn around and we often think of marketing and sponsorship as being one way. So we turn around and we say, okay, Mercedes is going to give us a whole load of money so that they can display their logo somewhere in the stadium or the grounds. That's not enough. In 2018, that sponsorship strategy is not enough. So we have to work alongside our sponsors to see what we can do for them and create the exposure and the awareness. Because Mercedes are not going to sell any of their cars on the grounds of the US Open. So the Mercedes aspect of sponsoring the US Open is really getting that awareness and that exposure to the customers that they believe share the same values that we do. So, for example, we would work with Mercedes, and so the first thing that fans would see as they walk into the grounds of the US Open is two Mercedes cars, and it may be the latest Mercedes versions of the cars that they're doing the promotion for the US Open. Mercedes would decide on that, but they would have the two cars parked and some kind of promotional activities going on, and that's because every fan that walks through the gates of the US Open will see the cars. Every fan will have the opportunity to participate in the Mercedes promotion that they have going on. And so this really does also give them a lot of exposure. In addition to that, Mercedes will drive the players to and from the hotels in Manhattan to the site. They'll drive the officials. And so, you know, they'll have their cars parked outside the five-star hotels with the US Open logo on the side of their cars, thereby facilitating the connection between the US Open and Mercedes, the brand. Now, when we talk about sponsorship in sports, it's interesting to note that two things. First of all, more than 65% of global sponsorship is dedicated to sports, thereby making the sports industry the biggest sector when it comes to global sponsorship. The second thing to note is that sponsorship deals tend to be long-term. You don't tend to sign a 1 or 2 year deal with Mercedes, you tend to sign a 5-year plus deal. So they tend to be longer term. So the important thing is establishing a relationship with the sponsor so that you can actually fulfill the needs of the sponsor and see what it is that you can actually do for the sponsor. And sponsorship evaluation is also important. So, for example, Mercedes wanted to check their effectiveness of their sponsorship of the US Open. So what they did was they looked at the sales of Mercedes cars in the New York tri-state area between October and January, which is the 3 months after the US Open. And they looked at the sales of those cars in the New York tri-state area for 5 years before their sponsorship with the US Open. And then they looked at the same sales figures and the same data points 5 years into their sponsorship with the US Open. And although I'm unable to give you the figures, Mercedes were able to report that there was significant positive contribution in those figures after the sponsorship of the US Open, which is why they had continued at that time. Ralph Lauren is another sponsor of the US Open, and so that means that Ralph Lauren, the officials are all wear Ralph Lauren clothing, as do the ball boys and the ball girls. The players get Ralph Lauren gift bags in their hotel rooms. But in addition, Ralph Lauren is an official sponsor because of the exclusivity that Ralph Lauren gets to the US Open database. So, for example, if we were to turn around and say to Ralph Lauren, Panasonic is also an official sponsor of the US Open, Ralph Lauren wouldn't care because Ralph Lauren don't compete with Panasonic. If we would turn around and say to Ralph Lauren, Tommy Hilfiger are an official sponsor of the US Open, Ralph Lauren would care because they do compete with Tommy Hilfiger, so we give Ralph Lauren the exclusivity that they have. United Airlines used to be the official airline of the US Open, and very recently we moved to Emirates. And this was an interesting one because Emirates is not a US company. So it was very interesting to kind of find out what it was that Emirates kind of brought to the table here. But if we look at what Emirates in terms of its culture is all about, Emirates is all about quality and providing a quality in-class experience regardless of the cabin that you're flying in. But they believe in high levels of customer service and match some of the values that we have. So when Emirates announced that they would be the official airline of the US Open, we also realized that it was a good match because that particular year, Emirates was celebrating 10 years of service to the New York market. And as a company that wants to increase their exposure in the US market, this seemed like a good match. But in addition to that, if you look at what Emirates are doing outside of the US Open, Emirates are really cracking into sports marketing. Not only do they support football teams like Arsenal, but they really are looking at baseball, they're looking at football, tennis, and other events. And they're cracking in because they're realizing that they have many advantages when they're looking from a sports marketing standpoint at reaching consumers in a desirable way. But when we sat down with Emirates to kind of discuss, okay, well, what is it that we can, provide them with? It was decided that actually an airport-style lounge at the US Open, where Emirates could showcase their culture, they could showcase the destinations they fly to. They would have people in flight attendant uniforms serving in the lounge. The lounge would be air conditioned, obviously providing food, drinks, snacks, and also a getaway from whether it was a really hot day in New York or whether it was raining. So we built an Emirates branded lounge, which is now in the grounds of the US Open, and in this way customers can connect with the culture that is Emirates. So again, working with the particular brands to see what's important to them in terms of that exposure and awareness, and then being able to turn around and deliver. So this is an interesting one. Celebrities at the US Open, and how much do they get paid? So they don't get paid anything to attend the US Open. But it is really free publicity for us and free publicity for them. At Wimbledon, they have a royal box. In the US, they don't have royalty, but they have a president's box. And there is a special department that deals with VIP requests. Obviously, a lot of celebrities are in New York, whether they are in fashion shows or hosting or being a guest on talk shows or promoting their new album, whatever it might be. They may be in New York during the time of the US Open. And so there is a special department that deals with VIP requests for the president's box. And it's good publicity, like I say. The reason why is the next day, Beyonce enjoys night match at the US Open is a great headline. And again, it helps us endorse the US Open in a very public way using this celebrity endorsement. So here are some of the interesting things, though, that we have to think about in terms of what the US Open represents and the future of tennis. So our chief operating officer turned around and said that tennis is the ultimate lifetime sport with people playing into their 80s. What that means is, if it was nice weather and you went down to the local park you could see on one tennis court 2 80-year-olds playing, and on the other court 2 8-year-olds playing. And tennis is one of the very sports that can happen. You know, you don't see that happen in many other sports. So it really is a true lifetime sport. In other ways, though, also with all the concussions and things that are happening right now in football, tennis is also seen as a very safe sport. So when we think about that, you know, we have to leverage and use the US Open as an opportunity. But we need to also ask ourselves this question: is tennis dying, and why? And so a task force study was done where under 18 participation was looked at in 4 of the main sports in the US. And we found that 55% play basketball, 71% play baseball, 77% hockey, and 89% football. And so the president of the USTA at the time, John organized a task force, which I was in, and we had to turn around and think about, okay, the engagement of tennis and what we need to do in order to improve participation levels in tennis. Now, you would think that if I turn around to you and the very first thing I said to you was, the US Open is the highest attended annual sporting event in the world. So you would think that by turning around and saying that, there would be a knock-on participation effect with tennis. But actually, we found that tennis is at 29% and dropping. And so there is a disconnect between having the highest attended annual sporting event in the world for those 2 weeks, and then the participation that takes place over the next year. So in terms of culture, we really had to look at ourselves to see, okay, what is it that we need to do differently? And there was a number of things that we found that were an issue. So first of all, tennis is seen as a middle to upper class country club style sport. You know, I could give you a football and 4 or 6 or 8 of you could find an open space in a park somewhere and kick that football around for 2 hours, and it wouldn't cost you a thing. Whereas with tennis, you need to have membership to a club, you need to have the right equipment, you need to have the right clothing, and so it can be seen as expensive. So that's the first thing. The second issue was that we hadn't made the sport kid-friendly so that kids could get into the sport. Many other sports, hockey, baseball, football, basketball, they had kids-size their sport so kids could get into the sport. But tennis, for some reason, in the US, we didn't do that. Many other countries, the UK, France, Spain, Italy, they had mini tennis, short tennis, sponge tennis. They had made the sport kid-friendly, but in the US, we hadn't done that. So one of the things that we turned around and did was we turned around and realized that if we were going to make an effect, we would have to align with people that speak the language of the audience that we're trying to reach. So when we did some research, we found that Nickelodeon was the most watched kids network in the US. And so we partnered with Nickelodeon here. We were providing that emotional connection through the characters that they already loved in our partnerships with Nickelodeon. And so we found, as is the case with many events, that when you team up with experts in their field, so for example, Nickelodeon in kids entertainment, when you team up and you form strategic alliances with experts in the areas in which they serve, that's when we have our greatest successes. We saw it at the London 2012 Olympic Games. We see it with the US Open. We saw it with Rio 2016. And hopefully we'll see it also with Tokyo 2020. So we developed this 10 and under initiative where we had lighter rackets, smaller courts with blended lines, and sponge balls that bounced the correct height for kids so that they could play this game. because this game is quite a technical game, and it takes between 2 and 3 years to really develop this game. But kids today want instant gratification. They're unlikely to stay with a game that is so technical in nature that they'll have the patience to stay with the game 2 to 3 years to fully develop. These days, if a kid cannot pick something up within the first 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds of doing it, they get bored or they get frustrated. So where they have, in an era of video games and iPads and technology and all of that kind of stuff, kids want instant gratification. So making the sport kid-friendly was something that had to be done in order to get more people in this age group playing the game, thereby making the sport younger and getting younger people. And the knock-on effect of hopefully getting more younger people playing the game is that more people will come through the pipeline, and there'll be more people that stay with the game and go to a professional level, but will have a wider pool of people playing the game. And I think that that's one of the key things here whilst we were developing this initiative. So the other thing that we do before the US Open starts is we host what's called Arthur Ashe Kids Day. And Arthur Ashe Kids Day it's almost like where tennis meets entertainment. So we have some of the stars from the tennis industry, like Serena and Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer. But then we also have people from the world of entertainment. So, for example, Bradley Cooper from the Hangover movies, One Direction, whoever it might be. And we have a day that is dedicated to kids on Arthur Ashe Stadium. And one of the reasons that we do this is because we are trying to do community outreach, and we want to get the community involved with the US Open. And we understand that the US Open, it can be quite an expensive event. If a ticket is $80, $90, for example, that's almost $400 for a family of 4 to attend. But Arthur Ashe Kids Day is a day where the tickets are relatively cheap, $10, $15 a ticket, which is affordable for most people. And here you're still able to see your idols. You're still able to come and enjoy this concert-style atmosphere. You're able to come and enjoy this entertainment that we put on just before the US Open starts. So this is kind of a really cool tradition that the US Open has had, and every year it takes place on the weekend before the US Open begins. The other thing that we turn around and realized is that although there has been a big focus on getting the sport younger and focusing particularly on the 10 and under category, the other area that we wanted to also focus on was the category of people between the ages of 21 and 40, okay, because that's an important aspect, because New York is a city that is full of young professionals, and particularly with the night matches, we want to encourage them to come to the US Open, enjoy the US Open, the old cliche, having a bud, watching the game with a bunch of buddies. So we wanted to kind of take advantage of that. So one of the things that we did is we started hosting these Rock the Set concert series, using our sponsors, like Heineken, for example, to host these. And this really attracted that kind of 21 to 35, 21 to 40 age group of people that we also wanted to focus on in terms of attending the US Open. So the other thing that we have to be aware of is we have to be aware of things that are happening outside the sport of tennis as well. We can't just turn around and say, we're a tennis event and we focus simply on world-class tennis and that's it. The anniversary of 9/11 most years takes place during the finals weekend of the US Open. And this particular year was the 10th anniversary of the US Open. So one of the things that the teams have to do is they have to find out what are the ways in which other organizations in New York are paying tribute to the US Open, and what is it that we can do that is appropriate and what can we do that kind of commemorates the anniversary of 9/11 in a way that people would be receptive to. And so during the 10th anniversary, one of the things that was noticed was that, didn't really want to have a whole load of videos where we kind of bring everything back to people's kind of memory banks, because that could be upsetting. So we very purposefully and in a very understated way painted the anniversary date on the court of 9/11, on the stadium court that commemorated the anniversary, as well as having Queen Latifah, I believe it was, singing some patriotic songs as part of the opening ceremony for the finals weekend. And that was something that we found that the research suggested that would be an appropriate way of still remembering 9/11 during this finals weekend. So the other thing that we wanted to focus on and look at was the fact that, for many events, for example, football, you see the draw of who plays who, you see that live on TV. Well, for the US Open, it's traditionally been behind closed doors. So in order to increase the hype of the US Open, one of the things the US Open did was they invited the defending champions back to do the official draw of the US Open, the official draw ceremony of the US Open. So this particular year, in the picture you see Belgium's Kim Clijsters, but there was also the men's champion that particular year was Rafael Nadal. And what we did similarly to Nickelodeon is we found out that ESPN is the most watched sports network in the US, and that SportsCenter is the most watched program on ESPN. So the US Open bought a segment of SportsCenter and conducted the draw live as part of the SportsCenter program for who plays who at the US Open. And this really led to the hype and the build-up of the pre-event of the US Open. So this is something that has been successful and has happened every year since 2011. So one of the things that we look at the end of the US Open is we look at all of our statistics, and we turn around and we say to ourselves, okay, in terms of our statistics, what are the statistics that really stand out for us? Because those are the things that we can focus on next year's US Open. And here you'll see that this was one of the statistics that really stood out. 173% increase using the iPhone and Android apps. And so that tells us that the social media presence and focusing on social media needs to be something that's really important, because we actually found that the research told us the average fan consumes the US Open using 3 devices. So for example, they may be watching the game live in the stadium, they may be hearing commentary on the headphones that are provided to them by American Express as they walk in, they may be using their phone or their iPad to keep up to date with scores or watch other matches that are happening on the outside courts. So people are very interactive in terms of how they consume US Open coverage, and this statistic proves that. So we use this statistic, this data point to, for example, build a social media wall at the US Open, and we continue to build those kinds of interactive experiences from that perspective. Also, we decided that we would put microphones in the players' boxes. The reason being, a lot of the time when you hear any kinds of disputes or anything happen, you are relying on the umpire or you're relying on the commentator to tell you about what's going on. Whereas here now we found that if we put the microphones in the players' boxes, that increases the drama of competition, and actually you can hear everything that is being said. And so again, that's one of the things when we talk about star players and star power, these are the kinds of statistics that we absolutely cannot ignore. Okay, we're coming towards the end here, and I only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to continue just for a few more minutes until I get to towards the end of the slide, and then I'll deal with some questions from there onwards. Premium apps are important because a lot of the times we're finding that we have to provide customers ways in which they can purchase things in the manner that they're used to. So developing premium apps where somebody from the comfort of their hospitality seat can make a purchase, and a US Open ambassador can then go and collect that purchase for them and then deliver that to them in their suite. Those are the kinds of that are important to be able to kind of deliver these fan experiences in a way in which fans are used to getting certain types of experiences based upon the type of customers that they are. One of the things that I hear quite a lot of is I hear, when in meetings and stuff, I hear websites are becoming obsolete, and we don't really need to focus on websites because everything is about apps. And I really do disagree with this point, because people still go to websites, traditional websites, for information. And actually, there are many studies that show that more than 70% of tickets are still purchased online through traditional websites than they are through any kind of app. Now, that may change in the future, but at this point, it hasn't. Okay, I wanted to go on to merchandising and sales, and talk about merchandising and sales a little bit before I answer questions, because we are unfortunately running out of time. But so one of the things I wanted to talk about is merchandising and sales is an important aspect of any event. And the reason why it's so important is because it's an additional revenue stream for an event. Now, if you look at these figures, when you have a US Open cap that costs around $30 and we're selling 66,000 of them, or a US Open t-shirt, so for example, a t-shirt can range anywhere from $30 to $40 to $110 if it's the Nike Dry Fit t-shirt, and we're selling 74,000 of those. But here's something I want you to understand. So the plastic rubber duck, so every event has a number of items that are under $20 in price, and that's because we need to try and have something at each price point. And the reason is, sometimes people just want something to say that they've been, it's a memento. They don't want to spend $50 on a t-shirt, but they want something to say that they've been to the US Open. So somebody in the merchandising and retail team came up with the idea of a plastic rubber duck that you get in kids' baths, or that you can put on the windowsill. And we looked at those and we turned around and didn't understand how those would sell. But it turns out that if you stamp US Open logo on anything, the power of branding means that it will sell. And so 5,600 sold at the 2010 US Open. So when we turn around and think about branding, you can, if your brand, if you have a good brand that is well positioned, knows its target audience, then the likelihood is whatever you put your brand on, okay, it's likely to be able to sell, because that's the power of branding. Okay, I'm going to stop there and just go through some of the questions. Now, I have some questions that were sent to me, excuse me, in advance. So I'm going to go through some of these questions, and then I'll take some additional ones. Is that okay?
Yeah, is that okay?
Another question I have here: what is the stakeholder to be considered the most important when organizing a sporting event? Is it the players, the sponsors, the fans, or the media? And actually, it's all of them. We communicate with them in different ways, and they have different levels that we need to kind of talk to them about things that are relevant to them. But they're all important because they all play a significant role in the delivery of the event. The event couldn't take place without the players. So if we don't consult with the players and we don't have a duty of care towards the players are not going to be happy with the way the event is run. It's not going to be happy with the way the event is scheduled. And the other thing to consider in tennis is that there's no off-season. In many other sports, there's an off-season where players can relax and train. Tennis is an 11-month-a-year sport. So we have a duty of care to be understood by sponsors. We have that two-way relationship, and I gave you the examples of how we look after the sponsors with Emirates and the agencies, for example, how we look after the fans by creating fan engagement. All of those is important. What is the economical impact for the city of a big sports event? It's huge. The dollar amount that this revenue provides in terms of economic impact is really important. During the US Open, all of the hotels in New York are full. The flights that arrive in and out of New York from different cities all over the world mean that the airlines do well. The restaurants in Manhattan do well. Tourism, takes an increase. So the economical impact is important because, the US Open provides provides a lot of economical impact, not just in areas related to sport, but in other areas related to hospitality, related to restaurants and businesses and everything else. So it's very important, and that's why again we try to solicit with partners in other businesses so that we can maximize the impact that we have. The next question says, in terms of promotion, what's the ideal period to start promoting an event? So with the US Open, one of the questions that we hear is, the US Open finishes around September the 12th every year. And so, people assume that because it doesn't start till August the following year, we don't start planning or preparing for the US Open until about April or May in the summer or the spring the following year. But that's actually not true. The management team for the US Open starts preparing for the US Open on September the 13th. Because if they start on September the 13th and the US Open ended on September the 12th, guess what? They now have an entire year that they can get ready for next year's event if they start planning the day after the event ended. Do you think that your team is the most important factor when organizing some kind of event? Undoubtedly. Team is a very, very important part. And actually, contingency planning, like I said, the example that I gave you, hopefully with hurricane, illustrates that. But the team is very, very important. And the team doesn't just consist of management and staff. A large part of the team is volunteers. In fact, we use many volunteers at the US Open. And so the training of those volunteers needs to be uniformly high, because those volunteers are at the US Open for 2 weeks, but they also are ambassadors for the event. So they are the face of the event. And so we don't look at our volunteers as a resource. We look at our volunteers as an asset, meaning that if they are the ones that are in charge of delivering the event experience. In other words, they are the face of the event. So when they interact with somebody, a fan at the US Open, they are effectively the face of the US Open in that interaction. Are there any additional questions?
Many through the Q&A. If it's okay with you, we can go through these questions, Deepak.
Sure.
Okay. Mogomotsi says, you mentioned people and team motivation in cases of disaster situation. How do you manage and implement this motivation?
So, I think motivation is key to success in any business. It does depend a lot on the management style. The US Open, we tend to have a very open door management style, but I think it also depends on the individual leaders and the individual departments. Certainly, when I'm organizing teams for the Olympic Games, for example, one of the things that I like to do is I like to know something about something individual about each member. Now, this is a little bit tricky when you're managing teams of around 200, But if you're managing teams of around 40 or 50, it becomes much easier. But if you can understand, for example, what is important to an individual, then you can really motivate that individual. So, for example, I'll give you an example. I have a very diverse team with the Olympics, and I have young people who are between the ages of 19 and 21. And I found that, two of those people in particular, they want to share their ideas with me, but when they're done, they want to go off and do whatever they've got going on in their lives. So, they want to share their ideas and get their ideas across in a very quick way, and then they want to continue doing what they're doing. And so, I facilitate that. But I also have an older gentleman who likes to have a coffee. And he also likes to share his ideas and his experience, but he likes to do it in a traditional way and in an unhurried way over a cup of coffee. And it sounds very simple. These kinds of things sound really simplistic, but actually I find that it works a lot when it comes to motivation. The other thing, I've been looking, for example, for more younger volunteers in some of the events that I've been running. And so one of the things that I've been looking at is going to schools that have hospitality programs. And when I'm recruiting people that are on those hospitality programs, having a letter of reference once they're done on headed paper, with the London 2012 Olympic Games on the top of the headed paper is going to be great for their portfolio. And I know that that's something that's going to motivate that person because they're trying to crack into a career in this industry and doing an academic course. So you're going to find out what motivates your individual people, and then find out how best you can do that. So I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, sure. Another one from Mark Dados. He says, was it that the contract with United expired, or it was agreed to finish the contract with them and move to Emirates?
I can't tell you. That's proprietary information, so I can't tell you anything to do with the contracts. All I can tell you is that when it comes to the end of the contract, the process is, the contracts are reviewed, but at the same time, we also look at who else is on the table. So, has there been somebody else that has kind of come into the frame? In this case, perhaps earlier on, Emirates wasn't doing what they were doing in terms of sports marketing before, but now they are one of the leaders in terms of sponsorship in the sports marketing industry. And so it was deemed fit that this would be a good fit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another one, you said that the US Open is the highest attended annual sporting event in the world. Mark says, how is it calculated?
So it's calculated on a per day basis, and so when you turn around and you look at that, we attract 700,000 fans over 2 weeks. And so when you turn around and you look at the figures, that's what makes us the highest attended annual sporting event. And this has been now for some time. This has been now the 6th year, I think, in succession that we have been at this point.
Mm-hmm. To what extent can the lessons learned from one-off events like the US Open be translated to a more serial sequence of events? For example, a season full of games for a hockey team, for example.
I think the thing about world-class sporting events is that even though there are significant differences in the sport, so for example, there's a difference between team sports and individual sports. There's a difference between amateur and professional. A lot of the skills in terms of the events themselves and the running of the events can be transferred. So if you know how to run the operations in a tennis event, you're likely to be able to transfer those skills in a hockey event, bearing in mind whatever the differences are within the actual sport itself. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to marketing, when it comes to human resources, when it comes to operations, you turn around, and I don't tend to like the phrase best practice, because best practice to me tells me that it couldn't be bettered. It tells me that it's at the final outcome. I prefer to use the term better practice. And so one of the things that, we like to use is we like to use examples of, okay, what are other organizations and events doing in terms of delivering high levels of fan experience, and how can we adapt that to the US Open? And so in your example here, you did the same thing. You would look at, for example, what is the NBA doing in terms of, so for example, one of the things the NBA are doing in terms of developing premium experiences is the fact that premium customers can order their food and beverage from their seat and have their food and beverage delivered to them while seating, watching the game, so they don't miss out on any of the games. So how can we adapt that for hockey? How can we adapt that for tennis? If we choose to do that. So there are many different kind of elements that are transferable from event to event and from sport to sport.
In the case of sponsorship, is it poorly determined on what the company can offer to US Open?
No, the sponsorship is the most important thing about sponsorship is that it's a two-way communication and a two-way relationship. So it's not simply what they can offer at the US Open, but it's also what the US Open can offer them. And if the US Open can't really offer them the level of exposure that they will need, then it will lead to an unhappy relationship. And because this relationship in sponsorship tends to be longer term, that's not something either party wants. So all of the discussions at the beginning need to be very open and transparent, and the brainstorm needs to take place between what can the event offer the sponsor and what can the sponsor offer the event. And there needs to be some good synergy there, not just in terms of values, but actually in terms of the offerings themselves.
Collier says, speaking about brands, just today I bought a set of 3 US Open tennis balls. The question is, why did US Open rebrand this year, and what do you think of the new branding?
So the rebranding is something that has happened very recently. In fact, it was only announced at our annual meeting a couple of weeks ago, actually, in San Diego. So this rebranding has only just come out. It'll be interesting to see. The most important thing is what the consumers feel about the rebranding. And, hopefully by the US Open time this year, we will get some feedback on what this rebranding represents. I think one of the things that this rebranding has been designed to focus on is, again, getting the sport younger. So we're trying to attract younger fans. We're trying to attract younger people, not just watching the sport, but playing the sport. And the rebranding that has taken place has that in mind. So it'll be interesting. I mean, I think it's a good idea. I'm interested to see, how this develops and what the opinions are of this rebranding strategy over time. But I think it's good because they're refreshing the brand, they're revitalizing the brand, and they're revigorating the brand to go after their target audiences to try and make the game of tennis more accessible to younger people.
Another one from Ruben. He says, do they use the US Open venues apart from the major tournament? Have you thought on organizing other events during the year to increase revenue?
So there is a US Open series that already takes place before the US Open, which is the Masters Series event to the run-up to the US Open. The issue of organizing additional events is that the tennis calendar is already very full. Like I said, there is no off-season. The tennis players actually probably want less events and not more events. But because tennis is such a commercialized business, there's a lot of demands, already on the players. So I think one of the things that the US Open focuses on is they focus on the maximization of the 2 weeks of the US Open rather than trying to have a number of additional events as well as the US Open.
Okay. Talking about promotion, Gary Callier says, do you think campaigns are more important than promotion events during a sporting event?
Well, I think campaigns are part of the promotional events. I don't think you can have one without the other. Campaigns are there and they're designed almost to kind of inform consumers about any promotions that they may be. Again, it's the campaigns, the marketing campaigns are there and they're designed to hopefully influence consumers in a positive way. That they want to be part of this. They want to be part of this unique tennis history. They want to be part of this unique sports culture. They want to be part of this unique fan experience. And so those campaigns are designed with those messages in mind, so that people can watch those campaigns and hopefully, get some levels of emotional attachment that turns around and says to them, yes, this is something I want to do. This is something I want to be part of. And as a result, go and buy tickets to attend the US Open.
Ruben says, how do you motivate volunteers to be an asset for the US Open?
The aspect of volunteer motivation is a tough one because obviously volunteers don't get paid and they also have long hours. So when we look for volunteers, I can say though that every year we're in a lucky position because our volunteer coordinator does such a great job with the volunteers that we are oversubscribed, meaning that every year we get applications from more volunteers than we actually need, which is a good position to be in because many events struggle to get the necessary amounts of volunteers, whereas the US Open doesn't have that problem. The other thing about the US Open volunteers is because of the experience that they've had with the US Open, they tend to be repeat guests or repeat volunteers. So, a lot of the times they'll come for several years and volunteer every year when the US Open comes. So they'll take either vacation from work or they just have that free time that they're able to do that. But volunteer engagement is important. And so, one of the things that we have to focus on is making sure that, for example, the work that volunteers are given is meaningful. A lot of the times when we think about volunteers, we think about giving them, terrible jobs that just need to be done, like sweeping trash. And, while somebody may be okay for sweeping trash for 1 hour, they probably won't be okay for sweeping trash for 12 hours a day for 2 weeks. So making sure that we make sure that the volunteers' work is meaningful, making sure that we understand that their contribution is valued and that we recognize them for the work that they do, allowing them access to things like the volunteer lounge, which is a lounge that they can go to hang out when they're not working. It's a lounge that they can go to watch the games. They can eat and drink, but also they have credentials where they can go on the courts and watch the tennis when they're also not working. So, providing them with meaningful opportunities to be part of the culture of the US Open. Because remember, one of the things that I said to you earlier on is that our volunteers and our staff are not simply a resource, they are an asset and the face of the event. So we have to continue to make sure that they are highly motivated, because if they're not, a volunteer could turn up on day one and commit to 2 weeks, but they could turn up on day one and never come back on day two and say, well, this is not something I thought, so I'm not coming back, and then we've lost a volunteer.
Okay, and we can go to the last one. How long does it take a sport event to prepare?
In terms of the physical preparation, so getting everything ready for the event, that can take anything from, several weeks to a few months. But like I say, the management of the US Open begins preparing for the US Open the day after the US Open finishes. And that way, they have an entire year to be able to get ready for the event. So I think it's important to be able to do that, because all of the strategies and policies and analytics from the past year, all of those things take time. And in order for you to be able to consistently ride, because the other thing that you have to go back to is, remember what I said to you at the beginning. What I said to you at the beginning was that the US Open is important because during these 2 weeks, 80% of the revenues raised during those 2 weeks will fund all of the tennis activities across the entire US for the next year. So we can't afford to have a bad US Open. So that's why it's important to have the full time period to be able to prepare for the event for the following year.
Okay, and let me give you just the last one. You mentioned that Mercedes improved slightly. How does it mean exactly?
Yeah, and again, that's unfortunately I can't give you the figures. All I can turn around and say to you is that Mercedes had reported that there was a positive contribution in terms of their criteria when it came to awareness, exposure, and ultimately sales in the New York tri-state area after their sponsorship with the US Open.
Okay. Okay, I think we've run out of time. We've been 1 hour 20 more or less speaking about organizing events and so on. Many thanks to you, Deepak, for your time. I know that you are a very busy man.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And many thanks to everyone for participating in this webinar. And sorry for the issues with the connection. You know, when we are organizing a live event, this can happen sometimes. But I hope that you have enjoyed the webinar as much as we have. And we want to remind you that you will get the recording of the webinar within this week. So Deepak, thanks again for your time and best luck for all your projects.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and thank you. Yeah, thank you once again.
A pleasure for us. Thank you, and see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.